What happened to Buddhism in the land of its birth? To colonial officials, the answer was straightforward. It had been forgotten by degenerate, superstitious medieval Indians. To Jawaharlal Nehru, it had been absorbed by an accommodative Hinduism. To BR Ambedkar, it had been violently extinguished by Brahminism. The right answer to the question is all of the above, but also in a way, none of the above. Buddhism retained a following in South India well into the 17th century. It was remembered for centuries as a dangerous, powerful rival of Brahminical thought, and its colonial rediscovery was revolutionary, influencing generations of intellectual leaders in the lead up to India's independence and ever since. I'm Anirudh Kanisetti, historian and author of Lords of Deccan. Welcome to Thinking Medieval, where every week we tell you something new about our complex, innovative past. Always feel free to check out our research and citations below, and remember that we're all figuring out how to think about our messy, bloody, dazzling history. As late as the 4th century CE, Buddhist stupas were the most impressive buildings to be found anywhere in South Asia. Especially along the Andhra coast, Buddhist establishments such as the Great Stupa at Dhanyakataka, today called the Amaravati Stupa, stood hundreds of feet tall and attracted donations from royals, monks, merchants, warriors, and craftspeople. Monastic interest in commerce, more in this video here, encouraged some of the earliest urbanizations in the Deccan region as well as the Andhra coast. At the ancient citadel of Nagarjunakonda, the site of today's Nagarjuna Sagar Dam, the kings of the Ikshvaku dynasty built small temples of Vishnu and Shiva. But these were eclipsed in size by the Buddhist stupas and monasteries patronized by their queens. Historian Mikola Gomez's essay, Decentering the King, Kingship, Identity and Power in the Ikshvaku Kingdom, explores this dynamic. Then something changed quite drastically by the 7th century CE. Preferring Shaivite rituals and metaphysics as well as the ideological support offered by Brahmins, a wave of new dynasties rose across the subcontinent, reducing Buddhism to near insignificance. We spoke about this here. Brahminical thinkers and singers mounted a series of verbal and possibly physical assaults on Buddhist strongholds and cornered royal largesse. Buddhists responded in kind. In Bengal and Lanka, Buddhist institutions retained enough support to survive and adapt to the times. In present-day Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu, they faded. But they didn't entirely disappear. The great Chola port of Nagapattinam in today's Tamil Nadu was home to an impressive stupa in the 11th century built by the king of Sree Vijay in present-day Indonesia, Malaysia. The stupa was, according to a donative inscription published in the edited volume Nagapattinam to Suvarnadwipa, quote, of such high loftiness as had belittled the golden mountain Meru. It was probably used by diaspora merchants, but also by a local Tamil-speaking Buddhist community. In her article, Nagapattinam Bronzes in Context, Cultural Roots and Transnational Maritime Heritage, archaeologist Himanshu Ray notes that hundreds of Buddhist bronzes were discovered in excavations there. Mobile ritual bronzes were a Shaivite innovation. Clearly, these Buddhist communities shared practices with their Shaivite neighbors. Tamil inscriptions in Chola-controlled Sri Lanka show that South Indian Buddhists even donated animals and ever-burning lamps to the Buddha, just as Shaivites did to Shiva. Even in regions that no longer had active Buddhist communities, the memory and political utility of Buddhism loomed large. In his chapter, Dhanyakataka Revisited, part of the edited volume Buddhism in the Krishna River Valley of Andhra, historian Jonathan Walter studied inscriptions made by a 12th century local king, Keta II of the Kota dynasty. The Kotas ruled from an ancient fort in present-day Amaravati in Andhra Pradesh, once linked to the trading establishment anchored in this great stupa. Many centuries after the great stupa was abandoned, the city was still considered sacred. Its new religious center was the temple of Shiva Amareshwara, which, as Walters notes, featured coping stones from the stupa in its foundation. In fact, the name Amaravati derives from the city's Shaivite history and is not Buddhist. The Shiva Linga was a 15-foot tall pillar of white sandstone. In fact, it still is the same pillar, possibly from the stupa. Similar lingas can be found in other medieval Shiva temples in Andhra Pradesh, including those at Draksharamam and Samarlakota. This sort of architectural reuse, whether a result of religious hostility or respect, is not uncommon in South Asia. King Keta II's coronation in 1184 was unorthodox. His court made significant endowments to Brahmins and to Shiva Amareshwara, but also gave Chola-style ever-burning lamps and animals to a Buddhist statue. This had been brought to the temple from the Great Stupa, and the endowments were recorded on pillars also taken from the stupa. The Buddha was described in these endowments as Sugata, well gone one, a name going back to the earliest practice at Amaravati. And Keta creatively had another inscription made in archaic-looking letters describing a legendary king of kings who stopped at Amaravati, took permission from the Shaiva deities, and made endowments to the Buddha in his residence at the stupa. All these were respectful appropriations of the city's Buddhist past, supporting Keta's own claims of being a king of kings. Indeed, one of his allies, the Lankan king Parakramabahu I, was Buddhist. And as Walters shows based on Lankan texts, ties between the island and Amaravati persisted well into the 1300s. The powerful Buddhist pontiff Dharmakirti visited it and performed a magnificent ceremony. He anointed Keta II's appropriate Buddhist statue with scented paste and flowers and bathed it in sesame oil, milk and water. At the same time, another important Lankan lord, Sena Lankadikara, built a stone temple to the Buddha in Kanchipuram. The latter indicates that Buddhist communities were still important in parts of South India. In fact, as late as the 1500s, the Vijayanagar Emperor Krishnaraya ordered the restoration of properties to Buddhist establishments in Tamil Nadu. This suggests that Buddhists were being bullied by local elites, but also that they retained enough political influence that a king would want to stop this. And in Nagapattinam, Buddhist bronzes were produced into the 1600s. As part of my research for the column, I also read Douglas Ober's Dust on the Throne, a thrilling account of the rediscovery of Buddhism by colonial archaeologists and nationalist intellectuals in the 19th and 20th centuries. Ober points out that even in northern India, where Buddhist communities vanished in the medieval period, they remained very much alive in texts. In some, like the Bhagavata Purana, they were depicted in conciliatory terms, with the Buddha appropriate as an avatar of Vishnu who tried to protect humanity from ignorance. In others, the Buddha instead introduced his doctrines to demons to weaken them, drawing them away from the true path of Vaishnavism. Many texts warned upper caste Hindus to avoid socializing with Buddhists. From the 8th to the 14th century, Buddhist arguments were reproduced and refuted by Brahmin authors, and they continued to be remembered hazily well into the 18th century. Buddhists remained the stereotype of the anti-Brahmin, the heretic. When a Buddhist refutation of caste was rediscovered and published by British official Lancelot Wilkinson in 1839, his collaborator, Pandit Subhaji Bapu, wrote a long, furious rebuttal. History, it seemed, was beginning to repeat itself with this rediscovery. Ober writes, and I quote, "For the first time in several hundred years, that great heretic, the outstanding dissenter, and foremost ancient challenger to Brahminical orthodoxy was returning to the public sphere." In subsequent decades, Buddhism, or perception of Buddhism, would not only shape Hindu reform movements but also nationalism and Dalit politics. Despite all its travails, the ancient religion still stands today. If you have questions or comments, we'd love to hear them. Follow us everywhere on social media. You can find me on Instagram at Buddha and at Connected Histories, and on Twitter at Kanisetti. We'll see you next week.